Erin Scar, Tillamook County Commissioner, Vice Chair of FTLAC. I will call this meeting to order at 10:01 a.m. And we will start with introductions. I think we will go around the room and just do our introductions. We'll start on this side.
Commissioner Bangs, Clatsop County.
Commissioner Will Tucker, Lynn County. Mike Buffo, Director of Technical Services, Mason, Bruce, and Gerard.
Let's go ahead and then we'll wrap that way.
John Sweet, Coos County.
Hang on online. We're going to finish in the room and then we'll grab the folks online.
Mike Wilson, State Forest Division Chief.
Brandon Persinger, Natural Resources for AOC and Executive Director for the Council of Forest Trust Land Counties.
Margaret Magruder, Columbia County.
Ron Zilli, State Forest Deputy Division Chief.
Nick Palizzado, Biological Support Unit Manager for State Forests.
Justin Buttress, Policy Analyst for the State Forest Division.
Samantha Hoffman, Executive Support for Mike Wilson, State Forest Division Chief.
Thank you. All right, let's move to online. Commissioner Sweet.
And John Sweet, Coos County. Aaron, thank you so much for taking the helm today. Sorry I couldn't be there in person.
All right, we're happy that you're with us remotely. There's a whole list of people online and I don't have control of that. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Commissioner Lovell.
Commissioner Lovell, Lane County, from the greatest Springfield city in the county.
Perfect, thank you. And then we do have, I think, a guest with us, Melissa Cribbins. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course. Thank you for having me today. Melissa Cribbins, former Coos County Commissioner. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. I'm not skipping you, Cal, but I know I'm going to hand it over to you in a minute and I'll let you do yours then. So we do also have some folks in the room. Would you all like to introduce yourselves this morning?
Good morning, Don Everingham, ODF, Northwest Oregon Area Director.
Jim Day, reporter with the Canyon Weekly.
Laura Wilkinson with Hampton Lumber.
Okay, so I guess I will get to Cal because he's going to be up for comments in just a moment. So I was going to go ahead. Do we have public comments this morning? Okay, great. Do we have a spot that we do that in this room? Why don't you come on up to the table, Laura, and we'll get you a microphone. That is
For the record, my name is Laura Wilkinson. I work for Hampton Lumber. Thanks for the opportunity to provide some comments today. So we're less than 2 weeks from the March Board of Forestry meeting where the State Forester and the Board of Forestry are going to make a crucial decision on the HCP. 3 mills have closed, have announced closures in the last 6 weeks, losing 183 jobs, millions in payroll and economic activity in Banks, Philomath, and Springfield. All 3 announcements cited challenges related to high log costs and reductions in timber supply. Harvest from state lands has hovered around 200 million board feet in the last 2 years, and ODF on track to hit around 200 again for FY24. This is down from harvest levels averaging 220 to 225 before ODF began prematurely implementing HCP policies. A reduction in supply means jobs will be lost. How many more jobs will be lost when harvest drops to 180 million or 160? Even less if harvest isn't maximized on available acres. ODF and the board still have time to right-size the HCP and improve harvest outcomes, balance conservation areas, and still meet the right criteria needed for HCP. Even a small amount of change will make a difference. Given the process of this HCP and going into an uncertain future, we need accountability and transparency from ODF more than ever. Hampton was disappointed that a bill put forward by Representative Jabity, HB 4106, that was supported by CFTLC, was not advanced this session. This is a good governance bill that would simply require ODF to tell us what they're going to harvest and then go do it. There's been a lot of misleading information from special interest groups on the bill, but if you actually read the language, I think you'll find that the ENGO concerns are misplaced. We hope that this bill is going to get brought back in 2025 and that it receives the support that it deserves. In the meantime, we continue to hope that the HCP conservation measures will be altered before more mills close and more jobs are lost. And Hampton is happy to provide specific suggestions on how we think that can best be achieved.
Thank you, Laura. Do we have other public comment today?
Madam Chair, Brandon Persinger with AOC. Just wanted to flag for the members of the committee that we did have some public testimony that came in, which has been shared with the members of the committee.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Okay, not hearing any, then we will move on to State Forester Cal Mokomoto. Cal.
Well, thank you, Chair. Appreciate that. And good morning to FTLIC. I appreciate the time to be here. I am the State Forester. For the record, my name is Cal Mokomoto. I'm the State Forester for the state of Oregon. And I am the third person in this meeting, I think, reporting from Coos County. So happy to be there. It's also to everyone's delight, I think. I'm looking out my window and I'm seeing sunshine, John.
We don't have windows here. I'm not in jail, but I don't have windows in my office.
Are you down there in Coquille right now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I know.
I'm not in jail yet.
Yeah.
Maybe.
You should have talked to Melissa Cribbins. You might have got windows if you could have worked it out. But,
She didn't have them either.
yeah, I know. Okay. Well, anyway, I don't have a lot to say because I'm just coming back from vacation. I'm using that as an excuse, but it's not really. We've had, as you know, we've had these listening sessions revolving around the HCP and trying to get that last bit of information in. Been meeting with some specific people who've requested and been getting a message. The comments are summarized. I understand they do have them summarized, and they should be coming out next week. And so that'd be available for FTLAC and others to see. And I hope that by the end of next week, I'll have my decision as to what I am going to recommend to the board. I have heard very distinctly that from basically two camps, the conservationists and people who are reliant upon timber for their livelihoods, which is many people in those counties. And that from that group, I've heard from the conservationists that they think this is a good plan and they can support it. From the other more prominent view is that I'm hearing largely that we need an HCP, but just not this HCP. And I'm hearing that. I'm trying to draw the line between these mill closures and the HCP, since the HCP has not been approved by the services. But I do believe it's probably linked to high log prices versus falling lumber prices. And that's always a problem from production facilities when those things collapse. But it also depends upon efficiencies of the plant itself. And there's another aspect, the landowners, and in this case, the counties are beneficiaries from high log prices. So we have to take all that into consideration. But the bottom line is that that's it, the HCP, whether or not, I think it really gets down to whether or not this is the right HCP. And if it isn't, then what's the probability of getting the right HCP? No specifics as to what that is. In my discussions with the services, I have not seen what I would consider to be an easy answer to that question. But let's just summarize now that I don't have a recommendation for you today, but I will have it out probably before the end of next week, before the board meeting and the board materials, and you'll be able to see the summarized comments. Appreciate your patience on this. This is a big decision, and I'm not sure, but the board will do what the board wants to do regardless of what I recommend, but I hope that they do listen to me and I can give them some counsel. So any questions?
Are you sure you want to ask that? So
No,
yeah,
I do.
Okay, wonderful.
Let's keep in mind though that we do have some time schedules here, and I don't want to be rehashing a lot of old ground. So Courtney, I see your hand up. I mean, whoever wants to ask me a question.
Yeah, Courtney, please go ahead, Commissioner Bangs.
I guess when we're talking today, I see in our paperwork HCP versus no HCP. And I feel like that there is a moderate middle ground that isn't being discussed. And that would be just circling back and writing a new HCP, or choosing a different alternative. And so I guess I'm still a little saddened by the fact that we're still focused on two extremes. And we don't have to choose one of those two extremes. The Board of Forestry doesn't have to choose one of those two extremes. They could choose a road down the middle. And I think that industry counties, we're asking for that middle road. We're not asking for something that is extreme. We're asking for moderate. We're asking for middle ground. And I just hope that as we continue moving forward in these conversations up through the Board of Forestry meeting, that we don't forget that there is the possibility of a middle ground. And frankly, we have 5 years to find it when you look at the settlement of the most recent lawsuit. So, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other questions for Cal before we move on?
This is John. I have a comment. First, I'm having a hard time hearing some of the conversation from people in the room. I don't know whether I've turned my volume up as loudly as I can. And then to Cal, remind you, a good compromise is one that neither party is happy about. And it seems that the environmental community is well satisfied, according to what you said, and I don't think our county community is. So maybe there's some room to budge a little bit more towards a middle ground. And hopefully there's some room to do that.
Commissioner Scar, I just wanted to interject. For folks in the room, these mics do work, but they're very directional and you have to be like right in front of it and within 8 inches. Otherwise, the folks won't be able to hear you very well. So just sharing that.
You on the microphone. So I think Margaret had her hand up first. I see you, Will. Thank you.
It's nice to hear from you, State Forester Mokomoto, and I know that I twisted your arm a little bit down in Astoria, and it was really a compelling information and testimony that was given in Astoria. I was sitting with a group of loggers, truck drivers, mill workers, and one of the people who gave testimony talked about how great it's going to be because we'll be able to have more tourist trade and grow that trade. And I turned to those guys and I said, you guys are going to make lousy waitresses because they are. I mean, that's not what they do and that's not how they make a living. And then we hear about these mills that are closing. In Columbia County, practically all of our mills have closed. We've got a couple left, but it is just devastating. And I think that Commissioner Bangs has pointed out, as well as Commissioner Sweet, that there's got to be middle ground. I went through a process of consensus for water. And what I find about building consensus is that, as Commissioner Sweet said, it's like a good divorce. Nobody's really happy, but I think that you have to guide the Board of Forestry to come up with some middle ground that will not devastate our timber counties. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Tucker.
Forester Makamoto, this is Will Tucker. And so thank you so much for your comments, but I'm a little concerned as you spoke about the mill closures and not seeing the impact the HCP has on that thinking. Having been a small business owner and closing that business owner after the 9/11, it wasn't 9/11 that caused the business to close. It was the market conditions around it. As I look at these mills, and what's happened the last few years as the Board of Forestry has slowed down the actual logging, that their supply is becoming more difficult to get because there is world market demand for private forest logs to go to Asia. And they're competing with choices about who can afford to buy them because there's less market of federal and state that have to be milled in the United States. And so it's not just that the plan is out there in the future, it's the fact that we've been reducing harvest as we move towards it. And then the level that it goes to, it is the tipping point. It's just the point where those three companies have bled enough and they don't see a horizon that is there. As I read those releases and have talked with one, I believe that they will in fact watch the market, not sell their mill for some period of time, and hope that something changes and may re-engineer to come back. And that's a possibility. But the reality for me is that we've always talked about the fact that we are seeing our output go down. It's been slowing down. It is now going down to to some new level, which I'm not quite sure exactly what that number is yet. But that is, when you run that business, there is a tipping point, and that announcement that the HCP is coming up, they can no longer hold out hope that the mill supply of logs is going to be something they can afford to buy and process. And you're right, it's a larger market issue. It's a whole bunch of things about how old those mills are. And I'm really pleased to have seen the investment Murphy and Weyerhaeuser have made in Lynn County, because I think that my mills might stay. But when one of those mills goes, it is huge. It's not 183 jobs. That's the direct jobs. That's a 1,000 to 2,000 jobs in the community. And so it is, I urge you, your comment, I know, and I don't believe you meant to be, but your comment came across a little bit not compassionate for those 183 people who won't have their careers anymore, whose employment plans and insurance policies, their medical care, all of that stuff is going to stop. And that is a big deal. And it's not 183. It's a couple thousand people that's going to roll out to be, and as well as taxes and all the rest that we live off of. So Cal, I appreciate you greatly. I consider you to be a man of honor. Just note that the way you presented that comment about the closures not being related, I think you should rework that before it gets really out in the public. That didn't come across well for me. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Commissioner Tucker. I know we would probably love to continue to visit with Cal, but I am going to get us moving forward because we have a full agenda today. Cal, are you going to be staying with us for this agenda and listening?
Yeah, I will. And
Okay.
I think we will be covering some of the things. And, I know Courtney says, we've been over this subject before. There's very little argument that we need an HCP because of the potential for lawsuits under a take avoidance scenario. But we're going to go through that and talk a little bit about that, and then why this HCP, I believe that's going to be covered. Now, I just wanted to make some clarity. I don't believe that, I've always believed that perfect is the enemy of good. And I'm not trying to get the perfect HCP because I don't believe that I believe that perfect is, and if I could get the good with the protection of species and production of timber, I'd be very happy. But in this case, we're not the deciders as to what is the HCP. And that's one thing. People, if you believe that there is a potential for one that's more middle ground, more moderate, and protection of the species, we're not the ultimate decision makers on that. And that's something I have to continue to evaluate. What is the HCP that we produce? Why this HCP? And I think that's a great question. Why this HCP? And then the second thing is, I don't want to be harsh when I'm talking about the 183 jobs. I feel that I've worked in mills. I've been around when mills closed down because of lack of supply. But at the same token, I've managed in mills too. And I know the decision-making that goes through, and it revolves around log costs and where they think those log costs are going to go. It revolves around the efficiency of the mill. When you're talking about a mill, you're talking about iron, Will, and I know that. And iron only depreciates for so long, and then you have to reinvest. And generally, when you do reinvest, you get efficiencies like less people working in the mill. I mean, if you look at that, and I'm not criticizing the industry is doing what it needs to do to survive. But to link it directly to us talking about the HCP, the line gets a little bit foggy, but I do understand what you're saying. It's just that continuing talk about reduction of supply and how that affects mills. However, I have to also represent landowners, and I'm going to say landowners benefit from higher log prices. And in fact, that's probably, if you're talking about stumpage and log prices, that's what they generate to get to do management work on their lands, to reinvest, to try innovative silviculture if they need to protect other values on their lands. Very similar to what we do at the state forest. We are reliant upon those stumpage values and those log prices to be high in order to make the payments and to invest and provide management. So that, I don't want to seem insensitive, but we do have more than one user group on the forest that we have to represent too and think about. But in regards to the HCP, it all becomes a little bit, for me, is there a middle ground? And what's the potential of that middle ground being approved by the services? And I guess that's where it boils down to a little. So not to seem insensitive to people who lose their jobs in the mills. I worked in one, and I remember this 65-year-old millwright coming up to me and looking at me was just when the mill was closing and just saying, Cal, what am I going to do? And I still remember that feeling of loss and fear and what's going to come in the future. So I am not insensitive to that. And I apologize if I did show some insensitivity for that. Okay, not to drag this on, because I know we got time schedules. Thank you for those comments. And I appreciate it. It's all going into my basket of things I need to look at.
Thank you, Cal. Appreciate that. I know Commissioner Lovell, you have your hand up. Can you do this in just like 1 or 2 minutes? Because I really want to get us going on our agenda.
Yeah, no worries. I just wanted to add to Cal's comment about that 65-year-old millwright. You got to remember too that we have a whole youth that's coming into the forest industry, and here I am at the Oregon Logging Conference, and that every decision we make will affect every person whom I'm walking around talking to and looking at today. So I just wanted to remind you that these decisions are far and wide, and we need to consider the total economy, which is what the Northwest is. We are a timber economy, period. So we need to.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Sweet, as the chair, I hate to do this, but I really would like to move us to our agenda. Is there something that you can hold?
I was trying to lower my hand. Maybe I got it
Thank
back.
you.
Thank you.
Perfect. All
Sorry.
right. Thank you. So I am going to hand it over to Mike Wilson, and you now have lost 10 minutes. So go.
Okay, so thank you very much. And so again, Mike Wilson, State Forest Division Chief. What we're going to be doing today is presenting a little bit of this is mostly made to create understanding about the why on the HCP, and then also how we got to this HCP. So I realize there's questions beyond that, but as we discussed this, the planning for this meeting, we really wanted to try and clarify some of that with everyone. So I'd like to start with a timeline that we put together. I'm going to cover it fairly briefly. I'm not going to go through all of these boxes, but you'll see that it is not up yet. Okay, thank you. Okay, and everybody has it in front of you, and that's probably, if you do, that's the best way to be able to look at it. So this goes back quite a while, and it's color-coded. The threatened and endangered species issues, most specifically, are above the timeline. And below the timeline are other things that have happened in the policy context for state forests as we've moved along. So starting with some of the things on top, the things that are probably most salient to an HCP. We had one for a while, if everybody will remember, from 1995 to 2001. And there was a scheduled reopener for that HCP around murrelets, because when we obtained it in 1995, we didn't know much about murrelets. So it was difficult to come up with a strategy and get an incidental take permit that lasted longer than 6 years. The permit for owls lasted 60 years. So we went into that reopener. In the meantime, coho had been listed, and we tried to incorporate fish as well. We had learned a lot about murrelets, so we pretty much had the terrestrial side of that in the bag. But anyway, so long story short, that effort failed. There were other attempts to get an Elliott HCP, both before and after a lawsuit that took place in 2012 to 2014. The key piece of that lawsuit that I think is really important to bring out is sort of the shaky ground that we're on with take avoidance. So this, and I'll go over this again in the presentation, but the services do not endorse any non-federal landowners' take avoidance policies. They're up to the landowner to come up with. The prohibition is simply on take. And so you're really hanging out there on your own. And we found out in the course of that lawsuit, even though we had had favorable correspondence with the Fish and Wildlife Service on some things in the past, some specific operational issues, not only did that not matter to the case, they were not available. They are not made available. The federal government does not allow them to come in and support your position. So it really leaves the landowner hanging out there. The only other thing I'll say about take avoidance, so I mean, the response to that for us, right, was to update our operational policies and move on. And we had started to turn out a little bit of revenue. We had recovered to that point where we had a positive NOI on the Elliott, but you know, all the other things happened. I'm not going to speak to those today. But another key point in the yellow boxes that you'll see on this timeline that continues to be a struggle for us in our budget is we have updates to survey protocols. Those protocols over time have only become more restrictive for us. The 2003 Merlette protocol update doubled the survey effort. Then the 2013 Northern Spotted Owl protocol doubled the survey effort. And we're facing an impending update to the Merlette survey protocol again. We are still, that was announced recently, and we are still determining how we're going to deal with that. But that will again double on average the survey costs for us.
Can I ask a quick question? When you say double, you mean, so the 2013 doubled the 2003?
So the 2013 doubled the 1992, actually, is what it would be for the OWL protocol. The 2026 will double the 2003. The 2003 doubled an earlier one between. Yeah, no, this stuff is in constant flux. The other thing we've also managed to do a fair bit of, I guess, adjustments in the past to deal with impending lawsuits that didn't happen. Probably the most prominent one was called the Strum Creek Agreement. And what happened there was, you know, we had an operation, take was alleged, and the Fish and Wildlife Service wasn't terribly happy about it, but I don't think they were actually going to end up pursuing an enforcement activity against operation against us. But then we had the several group, mostly Portland and Audubon, that decided that they were going to sue both of us if we didn't do something about it. And you know, quite frankly, the data was not going to put anybody in a good light. So we came up with an agreement, and this was during the negotiation of a previous HCP as well. So it's kind of like, okay, we can do that. We did end up deferring a lot of harvest in certain areas, you know, adjusting our harvest pattern during that time as a result of that. In the meantime, we were trying to get as I mentioned, an HCP from 1998 to 2009. Essentially, we were trying to get an HCP. Eventually, we did not do that. We instead adjusted our forest management plan, revised it in 2010 to lower our conservation commitments that we previously had from 2001, from the original plan, and also instituted what are called species of concern strategies. So that was a trigger already set up in the plan. It says if we're not going to get an HCP for some reason, then we will adjust to species of concern strategies. We play those out in our implementation plans in a variety of ways. The point being there, you know, these plan adjustments that we make to accommodate the fact that we didn't get an HCP, they're all well and good. They still don't buy us anything in terms of, you know, compliance with federal law and threat of lawsuit and so forth. A few successes we have had along the way with this is the safe harbor agreement that we currently have on our Western Lane District. We got that in 2015, revised that implementation plan in 2016. It allowed us to increase harvest for a period of time there. It will expire in 2028. But that's just an example of how what we call Section 10 mechanisms, HCP, safe harbors, candidate conservation agreements, how they can play out in our favor. Similarly, we have a candidate conservation agreement with assurances for Pacific Fisher as well, which was also a factor in decisions to list or not list that species previously. The federal government can consider basically assured plans that are not up for adjustment in their decisions. So if we look down here at the bottom, this is more of the policy piece, and I've already spoken to a few of these things. But, you know, just to kind of really make sure we're painting a clear picture of how we've implemented the FMP over time. You know, we started in 2001. We had some implementation plan problems. Everybody knows about, you know, quite apparently a big shortfall in the volume from the modeling there. And so we embarked on the 2003 to 2006 H&H modeling. That's where we tested HCP scenarios and a variety of take avoidance scenarios, increasing, stable, or declining. And, you know, basically the modeling came out such that that was the decision to drop that HCP effort eventually, although there wasn't really so much of a decision point on that as the board just decided to adjust the FMP and go with species of concern strategies. You know, that was the real decision point there. In the meantime, we had a legislative budget note to harvest at the high end of the implementation plan range at that time, which we did. We went into the Great Recession in 2008. Obviously, I've spoken before about the impacts that had to our staffing levels and so forth, but also we made the decision to implement high net revenue sales as a priority. So on the one hand, those are sales that don't require a lot of project work, and also the timber is valuable. So those decisions, you know, had the intended effect during the subsequent, during just our previous decade here, where timber prices ended up coming out of the recession pretty good, and our harvest levels were pretty high. And of course, variable year to year, just based on timber sale contract implementation too, not necessarily how much we offered in any given year. So anyway, now the place where we're at is trying to add back. We have added back capacity. We've restructured our workforce going forward, and we started pursuing an HCP again. So I'm gonna, you all have this timeline here.
I'm sure that this is generating questions for folks, but what we'd like to do is get through the presentation and ask people to just jot down your questions, and we're going to try to get through this so that we have time to explore those questions at the end.
I think I wanted to ask what we're going to do with questions. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I'll let you explore the timeline a little bit more on your own, and happy to answer any follow-up questions that come out of that. So if we could transition to the sort of the pros and cons. And I think this might speak a little bit to, oh, that's pretty hard to read on the screen, but I guess that'll be all right. So with the current HCP, sorry. Thanks, Justin. Thanks. Okay, so what this does is first we're going to look at GPV categories, greatest permanent value, which we are mandated to provide, and the board has to make the decision on and what meets greatest permanent value in our forest management plans. So we have our current forest management plan that functions under take avoidance. And the basic take-home message here, I think really is that there's a lot achievable either with current FMP with take avoidance or a new FMP. with an HCP, even the current draft of the HCP, which is that's what the comparison is here. However, there are a few nuances. Under take avoidance, we don't have the guarantee that future harvest levels and those associated jobs won't decline in the face of those future species listings or just change requirements under the ESA. And the development of recreation infrastructure and which is not something we've really focused on, but that's also subject to all of the same things, any of our management activities. And so those are also not covered. We pursue those with take avoidance. We have things in place. What the HCP really does would bring stability to these things, stability for all the covered activities, including harvest, and then anything that interacts with potentially habitat for the 17 covered species, which are, includes our recreation. So it's really just a more planful way of achieving a lot of these things. Economics the same way. Basically, there's uncertainty for all of these things under take avoidance, and there is certainty. There is less revenue, and there is less harvest under the HCP compared to what we've been harvesting under the plan over quite a few years now. And certainly we realize that, and there is a lot of pain on that for the counties, for jobs, and for the department as well. I do want to make that clear. We realize the reduction in revenue there. I'll be honest with you, I don't know that I see an HCP scenario that doesn't end up with less harvest than what we've seen in recent years. I guess the one thing I would say is this really applies to the environmental side of the equation too. The survey and manage approach is very haphazard. And so we end up, trying to plan for things under our forest management plan, but that's not where the species show up. And so we're chasing things over the landscape, constantly trying to adjust our desired future condition, which is where we, generally speaking, when we talk about the desired future condition, or the DFC as we call it, we're talking about the development of complex stands that are supposed to provide the habitat for those species that require, that tend to be late seral, older forest species associated. So the nice thing about an HCP is you're recognizing right up front the level of take, and so you're able to move forward with that. And actually have the plan in place and be able to follow it and not have to move things around the landscape. So if we can go ahead and go to the next one, there's also just a simple checklist here. That was by GPV category, just in terms of how we often talk about that. But then when we look at the comparison of an HCP with no HCP just on the take avoidance piece, this is just another way of looking at the problem. And so it provides immunity from ESA lawsuits with an HCP. We don't get that with the HCP, without an HCP. Provides a certainty in the management standards for the covered activities. I'll talk a little bit more about that later too. Management standards are relative to the covered species, and they can't be changed without ODF's consent. And that is, that is what an HCP really boils down to, is certainty over that, and a deal is a deal. Without an HCP, you don't know what's going to come in, especially from the legally challenging side. It's going to force you to update your policies and force you to update change. As I mentioned before, it provides a deliberate planning for the species, and it can help prevent future species listings as well. Once a plan is in place, draft plans are not allowed, are not supposed to be considered in that. Again, we are going to incur harvest reductions. And what I would just say is, we know that's going to happen with an HCP, with this current HCP. We don't know, and we have a good idea of what that's going to be. Without an HCP, it is unknown. And so I don't think we should necessarily be going on the assumption, the department does not go on the assumption that we're going to be able to harvest as much as we've been harvesting in recent years. And then, of course, the ESA compliance costs and logistics are predictable. I mean, you have a monitoring program and you have it doesn't have to just chase around every operation. So there is some certainty there. It's manageable. Unlike, as I mentioned, with the survey costs going up all the time with survey protocol changes that we've experienced. So again, there's that for you to dig into the detail on. So what I'll do is I'd like to launch into the PowerPoint, and this will be a little bit repetitive of some of these points, but a little bit more detail as well, and how we actually got to this HCP. Okay, so oh yeah, I think we can go ahead and go onto the first slide here. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the species listing history here. This is happening all the time. We have the northern spotted owl, we have the marbled murrelet. We talk about those a lot as terrestrial species. Fish species listings over time have continued to occur. A number of salmonids listed in the late 90s, a couple more in 2005. Eulicon in 2010, which is also a covered species, and Pacific martin coastal population in 2020, also a covered species under the HCP. Okay, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'd like to go into a little more of a dive with some of the legal issues that have either been directed at us or are one that's tangential but very telling. So in 1993, the Fish and Wildlife Service actually did begin an enforcement action. It's back when we still managed the Elliott. It was dropped eventually. Fortunately, they didn't have a very strong case at that point on that site. But they do pay attention and they can pursue enforcement operations. Well, it is relevant to us. We also had an issue, I believe it was a 1991 harvest of the Big Creek core area, which was shared between us and, at the time, International Paper. International Paper went and took their part of the core area. They were successfully prosecuted by the Fish and Wildlife Service and fined somewhere around $70,000, $80,000. So that did actually, those enforcement actions did happen. So I mentioned the Strum Creek agreement that we had. So in 2001, we had an operation. And this is a good example of operational policies. We were working to find the silvicultural treatments that we could do that would not cause take, would not result in take. And I would say that, we didn't have that all figured out yet. As I mentioned, Portland Audubon was going to pursue legal action against both ODF for the alleged take and against the Fish and Wildlife Service for failure to enforce. And so we worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service to institute the Strum Creek Agreement, that lasted 10 years. One thing that did help with that is it did help us define habitat categories for that, for a period of time there as well. Again, if someone were to challenge us on those habitat categories, I'm not exactly sure where that would leave us in court, but it had some utility, and it's actually an example that Fish and Wildlife Service actually worked with us on that to help us both avoid litigation. So just want to point that out. Murrelet lawsuit on the Elliott State Forest, Center for Biological Diversity sued us and alleging take, and it was basically, again, our operational policies. We thought we were doing a pretty good job. Turns out maybe we didn't have the strongest case. We didn't settle that case, but we did jointly dismiss it, and we updated our operational policies to be more in line with the science. So then in 2018, I think everybody's mostly aware of this one up front and center was the Coho lawsuit affecting our Tillamook, Forest Grove, and Astoria districts. Again, the Center for Biological Diversity sued us alleging take of coastal coho. We did settle that. It is settled until 2028, and we agreed to follow the draft HCP standards that are related to riparian and aquatic resources. given the fact also that we were looking at incidental take permits being issued sometime in the near future. It wasn't the worst outcome for us. It was something that we could actually go ahead and start accommodating. One relevant external lawsuit here, because I think some people question the decision on for us to jointly dismiss the Elliott case. It comes up every now and again. I just want to make sure everybody realizes all of the issues there were issues for Scott Timber. They were going to harvest the Benson Ridge parcel that they bought from that was part of the former Elliott State Forest. That was a parcel that could be sold because it was not part of the original Elliott formation. Cascadia Wildlands sued, alleging take of occupied habitat for murrelets, and a federal court permanently enjoined the harvest of timber there. So most of the issues in play in that lawsuit were also issues for us, for our lawsuit as well. Okay, so planning under take avoidance, and I've talked about this a little bit, but I just want to go into detail. Surveying areas outside of those that are planned for complex habitat. That is what we have to do now. We have to survey every operation that has potentially suitable habitat, whether or not it's in alignment with our plan goals, and also even if it's not great habitat, if it is potential habitat at all, we have to survey it. So it doesn't align with our forest management plan goals. The cost of the surveys and those stands of marginally suitable habitat versus the monitoring that you could do for stands that are intended to develop into habitat that are part of your plan, it's not cost effective. It's not a good way to spend your resources. You're doing a lot of looking in habitat that doesn't produce anything. And that's just, quite frankly, pretty much wasted money. Teeny species occurrences that are in or near those planned operations can impact them. It can either cause an operation to be changed. Sometimes it causes it to be dropped entirely. Again, the survey costs have increased over time with the increased intensity of the survey effort. And then, of course, there's always the threat of additional species listings as well. So in complying with take prohibitions, and this is, again, the point I want to drive home here, the federal services don't endorse any non-federal landowners' take avoidance plans. And so the only way that you get that is with a Section 10 agreement, habitat conservation plan, a safe harbor, and a candidate conservation agreement with assurances. Depending on the situation that you're in, one of those three works for you. The situation we're in, only a habitat conservation plan would actually do the work. So there has been a recent adjustment. It was a Trump era change where the services have to promulgate rules under the ESA under Section 4D that provide guidance on take avoidance. The guidance is not prescriptive. If you would like a good example of that, you could look at the recent guidance they issued for wolverine. And it says you can do all kinds of great things as long as it doesn't affect the conservation of the species. So that's not very useful for a landowner when they're in an actual take situation. So the landowner still has to design that strategy for themselves. And it also doesn't apply to past listings. So they're not going to be coming out, to my understanding, they're not going to be coming out with 4D rules for owls or murrelets. So that still leaves us in the same situation when we're litigated. The courts are going to decide if our policies are sufficient to avoid take or if take is occurring. Federal services, again, they're not available to help provide their opinion on the adequacy of our strategies and anything that they might have said in the past, which is usually fairly qualified anyway, is not admissible. So the outcome of an adverse ruling, I want to make sure folks know, is injunctive relief. Okay, so if they decide against us, they're not going to tell us what we should or shouldn't do to avoid take. They're not going to say, oh, if you'd only do this, it would be okay. The court is going to decide at the end of the day whether or not you're enjoined from doing the thing that you were going to do. Not, you could do something else, but the issue is, what are you going to do, or what did you do, and did that cause take, or will that cause take? Yeah. So, planning under an HCP obviously is a lot more certain. Survey areas, we're surveying areas. We will still be doing surveys as part of monitoring, targeted monitoring of areas that are a priority for habitat development. And that doesn't mean monitoring the entirety of the HCAs. Certainly, we're going to be coming up with habitat growth inside of the HCAs. That's basic forest inventory. We will be monitoring some T&E species sites inside of HCAs, not necessarily all of them. It can be prioritized. And monitoring of the aquatic and riparian conditions. And complying with HCP management standards, I mean, this is the best thing, is we have known requirements for management inside and outside of those HCAs and RCAs. We don't need to conduct surveys associated with operations or management activities. Potential impacts to the harvest units then are very minor and very temporary. As an example, if we somehow become aware of owls that we're not even surveying for outside of HCAs and they're nesting, we will establish a 70-acre core that we will not harvest for that nesting season. We will allow them to nest. And after that, we can take it. We'd probably leave a lot of those trees as lead trees. We'd make some decisions there within our purview. We're not, trying to be bad guys, but we will be able to take that site, and that's part of the whole plan. Monitoring of habitat taken versus habitat grown. So that is one of our key management considerations there, making sure that we don't harvest too much habitat outside or ahead of what is being grown. So we get the certainty and implementation and change management as well. Covered activities are evaluated and they have their known impacts. Those are addressed in the biological opinions. They do the take calculus on that versus how much we're going to probably take versus how much the habitat growth, the mitigation, the offset. We have a deliberate adaptive management process, and there is also a deliberate amendment process. Those are two different things. Adaptive management works within the current HCP and requires no changes. An amendment process will require changes to the HCP, but you still have your current HCP, your current incidental take permits in place while you negotiate an amendment to your HCP. So you've gotten yourself the coverage, and then you find you need to make a change, you are able to go out and try to do that. The amendment process goes through the same NEPA and biological opinion process that the original HCP does, right? It's all part of the process. It's all very, it's out there and transparent. Foreseen and unforeseen circumstances are addressed in the HCP, and there's no surprises. You know how you're going to deal with. There's a level of foreseen disturbance, foreseen circumstances. You already have a plan for how you're going to deal with those. And outside of that, those are unforeseen circumstances and don't create any changes in your management. So that's the kind of thing right there that, for instance, the federal agencies can't get. There's always a lot of comparison about that this is like the feds. It's absolutely the opposite of the feds. The feds wish they could have an HCP. The feds wish they could have a plan in place that they don't get sued over constantly. I think there's a point here. Everybody likes to pick on the federal Northwest Forest Management Plan. Let's remember, the agencies have never had a chance to really implement that plan the way it was originally intended to be implemented because they get their pantsuit off all the time. So anyway, that's with an HCP, no surprises. You have that insulation from lawsuit. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Nick, who's going to go into some more detail about the stepwise process that we used to develop this HCP.
Thanks. So Nick Palazzotto, Biological Support Unit Manager. And yeah, I'm going to sort of continue the theme of how did we get here focusing on some of the big steps in the process and then diving a little bit into the habitat conservation area design. So one of the first steps we took during HCP development was to determine which species we wanted to seek coverage for. We worked with the scoping team, which recall is Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, ODFW, DEQ, and DSL. So we worked with them to compile a large list and then applied some criteria to narrow it down. We looked at the listing status of each species under both the federal and the state Endangered Species Acts. We included those that were listed or proposed as candidates, as well as those that have a strong likelihood of being listed during the permit term. That determination, that potential for listing was based on both that current listing status and then consultation with those scoping team agencies, as well as evaluation of population trends and threats, and then ultimately best professional judgment. We also looked at the overlap of each species range with ODF managed lands. And species that had little or no overlap were excluded in most cases. So well, at the time, we were asked about wolves. At the time, wolves were still only on the east side. So that's an example. We assessed whether the species or its habitat could potentially be adversely affected by the cover activities in a manner likely to result in take, as defined by the ESA. And then we also looked at whether there was enough data on the species' life history, their habitat requirements, and their occurrence to both evaluate potential effects from the covered activities and to develop adequate conservation measures. This process yielded the current list of 17 species, and just to recall, it includes 10 fish populations, 2 aquatic and 1 terrestrial salamander, 2 bird species, and 2 mammals. Another early step was to define the covered activities. We applied some criteria here too, including the locations of the activities and the permit area. For us, that's essentially, all of these activities occur across the entire permit area. Whether that activity had a reasonable likelihood of causing take of covered species, whether there's enough data to describe and quantify impacts, and whether the activity is one that we have the ability to control. And so the list we came up with include the full suite of timber harvest activities. So that's, hauling, yarding, logging, et cetera. Reforestation and young stand management, road system management, quarries, minor forest product harvest, some fuels management, recreation infrastructure and maintenance, and implementation of the conservation strategy itself. And it's a pretty live list through the HCP process. Like, we've continued to sort of look back at it and make refinements and minor revisions through time. A couple things it does not include. It doesn't include recreational activities themselves. So including hunting and fishing, it doesn't include the public using the forest. It's the infrastructure itself. Does not cover herbicide application. Long story there we could get into if people are interested. Nor does it cover third-party easement activities that are not under our control. So I thought I'd start at the top, really, sort of at the beginning. What is a conservation strategy? What's supposed to be therein? The longest step in the process is the development of the conservation strategy itself. And the strategy details how we will avoid, minimize, and mitigate take of the covered species, and thus qualify for incidental take permit issuance. It defines what the HCP is trying to accomplish through biological goals and objectives. And you may have heard that phrase before, you'll hear it again. Sometimes we refer to them as the BGOs. But the biological goals and objectives are a key piece. I'll describe them a little bit further in the next slide. It also includes conservation actions, and that will be implemented to achieve the biological objectives. And then it describes the monitoring program that we'd use to track progress and how we would adjust implementation over time via adaptive management. Okay, the biological goals broadly describe the desired future conditions of an HCP in succinct statements. The goal must be sufficiently specific to guide the conservation strategy during the implementation of the HCP. And so if you look at the current goals, you'll see they're quantifiable, and that's what gets to the specificity piece, specifically the objectives, actually. The objectives describe the incremental steps taken to achieve a biological goal. Often multiple objectives support a given goal. And the objectives are how we measure the HCP's performance, and thus they have direct influence over the monitoring program. Under our HCP, the biological goals for all of the covered species are essentially to support their persistence in the permit area over the 70-year permit term. The objectives for fish generally cover following elements: promoting long-term wood recruitment, enhancing channel complexity through targeted enhancement projects, maintaining and enhancing water quality and quantity, and improving fish passage. And then for wildlife, the objectives are to conserve, maintain, and enhance occupied habitat, so current occupied habitat, other suitable habitat that's existing, and then to also increase the quality and quantity of habitat during the permit term. It took 6 months for the scoping team and the steering committee to agree on the basic language of the biological goals and objectives. So this was very early in the process, and it was one of the first things we did. And it took 6 months of back and forth tinkering with single sentences. And without any numeric, there were no numbers involved at that point. The acreage targets that are in the administrative draft currently came later. And based on the modeled outcomes. Slides. Okay, so the aquatic strategy consists of specific actions that will be taken related to riparian buffers, road system management, stream enhancement, and fish passage barrier removal. The general framework for the riparian conservation areas, or RCAs, also took another 6 months of scoping team and steering committee discussions. So we got to the biological goals and objectives and then moved to the aquatic strategies and really spent 6 months or so developing the buffers, the conservation areas, focusing first on the ecological functions and processes of interest. So what is it that we wanted them to account for? And then on how to adequately address them. We made many clarifications and refinements to each action since. I'm not going to go into further detail today on the aquatic strategy just for the sake of brevity, which is a relative term. But let us know if you have specific questions. Conservation strategy, the terrestrial conservation strategy incorporates those riparian conservation areas where applicable, but also includes upland habitat conservation areas, or HCAs for short. Management is allowed in those habitat conservation areas, but is focused on habitat development for the covered species. There are also some retention commitments for leave trees and harvest units outside of the conservation areas, and some specific actions such as seasonal restrictions, species-specific actions such as seasonal restrictions, and our barred owl removal program. Okay, so digging in now into the development of the HCAs themselves. Habitat conservation areas were designed with an iterative review process involving multiple data sources and layers of review. They're the primary vehicle we're using to address the goals and objectives for the terrestrial covered species. And the boundaries were drafted based on a number of important concepts for the covered species. Biological considerations include species occurrence data, both current and historic. So the HCA's protect known active spotted owl sites, marbled murrelet occupied habitat, and red tree-voles nests. And for owls and murrelets, we had almost 30 years, over 30 now, of surveys and research to guide us on where they occur or have occurred. The conservation areas also include inactive or historic spotted owl nest sites, particularly those with a consistent, so it's not all of them, but some of them, it's those with a consistent history of occupancy and reproduction. While some of these sites have not had a response in some time, they still represent some of the better core habitats on the permit area and were important to the scoping team. For habitat, we used a number of data sources, including current and projected modeled habitat, LiDAR to identify vegetation characteristics and topography, stand ages. We looked at complex structure in the context of our current plan. So where does it exist now and where were we designating it for the future? The conservation areas incorporate the majority of existing suitable habitat, meaning more than half, for the covered terrestrial species, and also areas where the habitat models show high potential for habitat development over time. Other areas have lower or marginal suitability, are also incorporated to create larger suitable patches over time and to provide connectivity across the permit area and from or among adjacent federal lands. We incorporated landscape function and design considerations and sought to minimize edge, maximize interior, and enhance connectivity while ensuring distribution across both districts and elevations. They're intended to be a network that allows for population flow. The size and location of HCAs are intended to be robust enough to be resistant and resilient to disturbance and thus durable, which is something we heard from stakeholders for over a decade now, a desire for durable conservation areas. The size and proportion varies by planning area and district and county based on ownership and landscape context, species distribution, existing habitat, and a number of other factors. So it doesn't look the same on every district or in every county. And the overall commitment provides flexibility outside of those habitat conservation areas by providing the bulk of the conservation lift for the covered species. And many other species benefit as well. Briefly, we also did look at some operational considerations. It was based on a field-led effort to characterize the harvest potential of individual stands. They grouped each stand into one of 4 categories, basically good, average, marginal, and poor ground based on these parameters: site class and production capability, logging and yarding logistics, access to and proximity to roads and mills, neighbors and local issues, scenic considerations, domestic water sources, basically all of the other non-biological considerations sort of condensed into an oversimplified layer. I want to be clear, it wasn't a major driver of the initial design, but it was used to inform boundaries and then the subsequent revisions that did occur. Okay, and then to speak to the stepwise iterative process a bit, it occurred over much of 2020. The first step was the development of an ODF biologist-led draft. So at the time, I was the lead wildlife bio, and myself and the other bios sat down for a couple months and worked through the landscape using the criteria that I just listed in the previous slides and with scoping team review. That cut, the biological cut we were calling it, then went to field staff from each district that then conducted a relatively quick review and made suggestions for additions and removals based on operability. Division leadership then conducted their review, which entailed several full days of adjustments based on that field input. We made a few additional post hoc refinements to remove some harvestable area and include additionally operationally limited area, so more tweaks. All seeking to find better balance from just a strictly biological cut. That draft went through scoping team review again. We had some subsequent minor adjustments made to add back some older stands that we had pulled out. We then made some operational boundary adjustments, minor adjustments of all the boundaries to improve operational efficiencies on both sides of the HCA. So when you go out to do a harvest on either side, that you're well set up and you don't immediately hit conflicts associated with sort of both land use designations. That finished product, that took most of 2020. The boundary adjustments were early 21, and then that fed the modeling for the comparative analysis. So I wanted to show an example of sort of overlap of the covered species and how operationally limited areas were incorporated. So this map shows most of the Tillamook district, sort of northern 2/3 in blue here. You can see the Clatsop County line to the north, Tillamook Bay in the southwest. You can see this is Nehalem Bay. Got the Salmonberry corridor, I think, out here, if people can see my cursor. And then Highway 6 coming sort of this way-ish for context. The HCAs are the green hashed marked polygons that you can see on top of the blue. And now these black circles show the locations of owl sites that are considered active under the HCP. They're mostly on the west side of the forest, outside of the Tillamook burn. It's worth noting, though, however, that these two sites here and this easternmost site are actually all in the burn. They're relatively new sites that have been established within the past, let's call it 12 years now. So the burn kind of coming back online and owls starting to appear there. These darker polygons now that you see on the west side, they're supposed to be dark green. They look-ish. Those are marble murrelet management areas. These are occupied murrelet areas. Again, they're clustered mainly on the west side of the forest, outside of the burn. But the overlap with owl sites is generally poor. And so note this large habitat conservation area to the north, no active owl sites, but a long history of marble murrelet occupancy there. Similarly, just east of Garibaldi, you've got some occupied murrelet areas that are not related to any owl sites. And then you have some overlap you can see inside some of the circles. If we turn on owl responses, these are the blue dots. We can see that that large HCA to the north with no active owl sites had a long history of, where'd my cursor go? There it is. Had a long history of spotted owl activity prior to barred owl invasion. This area once had several active sites with breeding pairs and offspring that went on to establish nearby sites and breed themselves. These types of historic use areas with these long histories of occupancy and productivity remain important to spotted owl conservation and population recovery, and will be one of the focal points for barred owl management under the HCP. So this would be an area we'd be very interested in seeing what happens when barred owls are removed. Add the murrelet observations, see again, quite a bit of overlap up north then, less so down south. We don't survey for red tree voles under our current policies, but these yellow squares are red tree vole observations from exploratory efforts by federal and university scientists.
more on the southern end of the forest that aren't shown here, and also some more sort of up the west side of Clatsop County. But so, to be clear, we don't really know where they are on our landscape all that well. Where people have looked, or where they've found them is sort of overlaps with owls and murrelets and these habitat conservation areas. We tried to use operationally limited ground, which is shown in red, where we could, to increase the size of the habitat conservation areas and then provide connectivity. Most operationally limited ground is on Tillamook, however, so we couldn't over rely on it and still meet the biological goals and objectives. Areas within habitat conservation areas, but otherwise unconstrained, are either, not operable, not covered by some occurrence, say this area here north of these owl circles. It's either habitat that is currently unsurveyed or opportunities for management activities to promote habitat. This table shows the breakdown of acres inside those conservation areas by operability and by existing constraints. The habitat conservation areas represent 43% of the total permit area. After the riparian conservation areas are excluded, that falls to 37%. So you got 43% plus 6% that's inside of them. And so just the upland portions represent about 37% of the permit area. After the inoperable acres and existing occupied sites are excluded, that is, inoperable acres, existing sites. Dang it, my boxes are messed up. That's okay. There's about 20% remaining. So you have the conservation areas, you remove the riparian areas, you take out the inoperables, you take out existing occupancy, you take out the areas we can manage, and you've got about 50,000 acres remaining that are inside of the HCAs, but otherwise in constraints. That's 8% of the total permit area. It's about 20% of the habitat conservation areas. And here's the breakdown for those areas outside. It includes about 57% of the permit area. Then you remove the riparian conservation areas and the inoperables there, and you've got about 300,000 operable acres outside of conservation areas. These acres combined with the acres we can manage inside the HCAs comprise 59% of the permit area. Operationally limited acres were included where there was biological rationale, as we said. However, it's worth noting that there are still disproportionate inoperable acres inside the HCAs. So 8% of the total acres and 20% of the habitat conservation areas are inoperable, whereas outside it's 3% of it's 3% of total acres and 6% of the area outside. Okay, I got something else. We were asked by the board last February to describe the extent to which habitat for the covered species overlap inside the habitat conservation areas. This pie chart shows the modeled habitat for owls, murrelets, and tree voles. Habitat for murrelets or red tree voles or both overlap with spotted owl habitat on 70% of the acres. So that's the yellow, blue, and gray combined are about 70% of the habitat, and it's all three species overlapping. And then the remaining 30%, the orange in this pie chart, types out as spotted owl habitat only. Largely, this is due to differences in the species ranges. So spotted owls occur across the whole permit area. Murrelets and tree voles are more limited. The point here is that there's really no additionality from murrelet and tree vole habitat. And
This isn't surprising, given that a driving premise of these habitat conservation areas is that covering for northern spotted owls mostly covers for other species. Okay, one more slide. I wanted to point out that while passive management will play an important role for the majority of the acres within the HCA's, the HCP will also use active management within habitat conservation areas to help meet the biological goals and objectives. This is an important distinction from management outside of habitat conservation areas. The activities within will not be economically driven, although positive volume and revenue gains may result from them. The impetus for management activities within the conservation areas will be to increase quality and quantity of habitat over the permit term. Silvicultural treatments will use ecological forestry and other tools and techniques to foster the old characteristics that provide for increased habitat quantity and quality, such as large trees, multi-layered canopies, structural complexity, and compositional diversity. Variable density thinning and other density management tools may be applied to conifer stands where appropriate, and selective harvests within variable retention strategies would be implemented in some younger stands. Stands with low potential to grow into habitat, such as those that are infected with Swiss needlecast or hardwood stands that have little or no conifers, would be treated more heavily, essentially a regen harvest, to reset and accelerate trajectories toward habitat. And all these activities would be designed to minimize short-term negative effects while still achieving long-term habitat development. And the HCP allows for 75,000 acres, as I've said, inside the conservation areas to be managed over the first 30 years of the permit term. And the intent there is so that the habitat gains can be realized over the permit term. Now I'll pass it back to Mike to talk about process risk.
Yeah, I'll just, and this is just a quick one. I don't want to belabor it. I think we've heard a lot about this as we've gone through this. There is the question of just what is the increased time and analysis associated with changes to the proposed action under the HCP. Proposed action as presented in the EIS. And there's questions for the EIS. There's also questions for the biological opinions. Whether it goes inside or outside the scope of the EIS in some fashion could create triggers, although it's still not entirely clear what those triggers would be. How much of a delay is created with any specific action. And the biological opinions, essentially those aren't going to be done until we land on something final. So right now, I do want to be clear, there's been some back and forth about the services and are they holding us up? And the answer is at this point, no. What's holding it up is them not knowing what they're going to analyze for the biological opinions. So there are questions and there's no real firm answers on just how long it would take or just what kind of delay would be incurred by changing the proposed action. Except that it could be significant. So I think that is pretty much all that we had there. We got through that pretty quick and happy to turn it back over. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So I want to put a little context around the next piece of this, which is the opportunity to ask our questions. So we all know that we are waiting for State Forester Makamoto's recommendation that will go to the Board of Forestry on the 6th. We know that we have two opportunities to speak related to that. One is the FTLAC testimony, which is a 15-minute window, which we have the opportunity to determine how we wish to use that in terms of who speaks and what we say. There will also be a limited amount of public comment when that agenda item comes up because it is an action item. So I think I want us to think about as we're asking our questions, preparing our testimony. What is it that we really would like to hear from folks as we think about testimony, as well as what we would like to know for our own knowledge? But I just want to contextualize we are coming to a space where the final words will be spoken. So please ask the questions that will help you know what you believe those final words should be. And with that, we will go to questions. Commissioner Banks had already reached out with her first question, so.
Okay, well, I'm always happy to yield to a commissioner, but I'm also happy to jump in if you would like me to. So for those online, this is Brandon with the Council of Forest Trust Land Counties. So I guess my question, I jotted down a few during that presentation, but I think I'll start with the first one and then yield to others. If the draft includes the retrieval and it includes a chapter on financial certainty, as well as other pieces in the draft that we know either have been changed or are needing to change because the retrieval ended up not being listed. That decision was made a week or so ago during the December joint meeting between the Board of Forestry and the FTLAC commissioners. It was pointed out that the financial certainty, the department most likely will need to go to the legislature for additional funding. I guess my question is, what issues or how many changes from the draft would need to occur in order to get a new EIS or a new plan analyzed by the services before an official review by the board? Happy to rephrase it if that was a little confusing, Mike.
No, I think that's all right. I think I get the gist of it. So we would still be including the retrieval as part of the HCP. Just because it wasn't listed this time, again, doesn't mean that it won't be in the future. And as Nick pointed out in the habitat overlap piece, it's largely accounted for in other species habitats. But another thing is that we will, so if we take a species out, for instance, it's not a question of modifying the HCP. That definitely, I mean, it would modify the HCP. That definitely takes it out of the EIS current draft space. It starts the EIS process over entirely again. So there's a question of what it would take to modify those strategies, and then there's the question of what it would take or how long it would take for the EIS process as well. So the question around the financial piece is,
I guess my question is, how many changes from what the services originally looked at for the draft would need to occur in order for them to reanalyze a new draft, right? If so many aspects of the plan have potentially changed here, when do we say, okay, we've changed a significant portion, here's a new draft to look at and to analyze? Because we know the modeling numbers have changed, we know, and you know, your slide that you put up a little bit ago, slide 8, you talked about the ability to make changes through the amendment process or through the adaptive management process. So taking out the retrieval because it's no longer an issue, there are ways to mitigate that going forward.
once we have an HCP, then you can have an amendment.
Yes.
Yes, yes. There are ways to deal with that. There's ways to deal with a whole host of things going forward, you know, one of which would be if a species is declared extinct, right? You'd probably want to modify your HCP and do an amendment. But so the piece on what's been brought forward, what changes actually triggered, we don't have good clarity at this point still on whether or not how much updating and so forth needs to be done to the EIS, even given the new modeling outcomes with a lower harvest level than was originally in the EIS. So that is actually still not clear. So what changes would trigger a new EIS? It's also a little bit complex. We don't have perfect clarity on that either. For instance, you know, if you go and you make the acreage adjustments that were made, for their alternative 5, does that trigger a new EIS or not? And I think there is, we don't actually have full clarity on the EIS piece for that.
I maybe ask the question possibly in a different way. I think so Mike, can you remind me when you applied to HC for the install take permit? That was a couple years back. Is that right? Like 20?
Oh, well, yeah, it would have been just before, a couple months before the EIS process started, because that was necessary to start the EIS process.
Okay.
To start the NEPA process, I'm sorry.
Right. So you applied and so, and there's been some minor changes to the HCP draft since the application was submitted. Though our understanding from before, for example, was that the biological opinion would be based on the application. And maybe that's not the case. It sounds like there's still some question here. I think what Brandon and the commissioner are asking is, since that application has happened, what amount of change can happen to the HCP, you know, for there to need to be a change in the EIS? Is that right?
Yes, essentially.
Yeah, so that is what, we don't have good clarity on that. There's no, like, if we change HCA's by X amount of acres, does that trigger a new EIS or not?
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask go ahead.
And so I also want to be clear that the changes that we've been making along, so an HCP draft is essentially kind of a live thing up until it is final. And I want to make clear, the Board of Forestry, the applicant, right, ODF, the Board of Forestry, any of it, we don't make the determination on whether an HCP is approved. Services make the decision on whether it is approved. We're putting forward that application. And we continue to work with them throughout the process. It's most, you know, and just to give you an idea of the scale of the changes, they're really language clarifications to make sure that we don't have conflicting language here in the HCP and all of that. Some additional work on the adaptive management section, just to make sure we're clear on the triggers and what the process would be, on how we would meet and deal with, go through the adaptive management process. And then also some little changes, they're not prescriptive changes, but some changes to address fuels in HCA's, disturbance in HCA's, minor operational boundary issues with HCA's, because even though we went through that review and it was very well done, you know, you don't know till you get there. And so it's kind of like, you know, but these are things that are minor changes, right? These aren't anything that would really result in an overall acreage change or an overall outcome.
Maybe that's like my follow-up question, if I may, about process risk, is that that's what our understanding has been, is that there's been very minor changes since the draft HCP. There's been minor wording changes, potentially there's been minor HCA corrections, I'll say. But so we saw the draft HCP, we saw impacts from the draft HCP in the EIS. We saw, you know, further modeling around that, but it seems like there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of meetings here around, you know, what the HCP is and, you know, what the impacts are and what could happen. But because the application has been submitted, it seems like there's also been kind of a locking in of the broad scope of the HCP. So I've kind of wondered what, you know, what the value of some of these discussions actually have been around, like what changes could occur to the HCP. How do we understand what scope of change is possible now that the HCP is largely locked in because of that application and because of a relatively narrow range in the EIS? And so what kind of changes could be occurring that would create like, for example, the services not knowing what HCP draft they're doing a biological opinion on, and what subsequent changes could ever happen to the HCP, you know, once that application was submitted?
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, I hate to do this. There's a big, it depends here. You can change the proposed action. You can change the proposed action and you don't have to resubmit. per se. You could change it and just run into having to start the EIS process over again within that application. There's an alternative. I think if you were going to completely pull it out and change it in a big way, whether you would need to actually resubmit the application or not, or something like that. But so are you locked in? Well, you're locked in to the extent that the applicant wants to change or not. And so the applicant has to size up all of the different factors about when, how long they want to take to get to the HCP, and what the goals are for that HCP, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, is there something else that would fit and that would make more sense and is worth starting that all over again?
We've had a lot of conversation here, and I know a lot of stakeholders have come to you. And so it seems like the upshot though, right, is if the applicant wants to change the application, the applicant could change the application, and sort of through this period, really nothing's brought the department to the point of wanting to change the application. Is that right?
That is correct.
I think what would be helpful, what is on the website for public review, is the HCP draft plan dated February, it looks like February of 22. If there have been changes made to the draft plan, it would be really nice to know what those are. So we have the ability, when we testify before the board in a couple weeks, to tell them the changes that have been made, good changes. Or we would recommend doing something different, right? Not knowing what has changed makes it difficult for us to comment if this is the final opportunity before the board.
Thanks, that's helpful. And we will get you a list of changes that have been made, and that's about as good as we can do. The services don't want the HCP put out again. That is my understanding. But we can do a list of actual, like, here are the things that change or have changed in the interim.
Yeah, not every change has been vetted through the scoping team. Not everything that's in the current marked up draft has been thoroughly vetted. And so we can go through the ones we know are okay and compile all that. It's harder to, if we send you, there would be things that the service may not have seen that would then be out.
Well, I guess my point is whatever is going before the board.
Yeah.
That the board is going to make a decision on. It would be very helpful for the commissioners and for the counties to know what's going before the board so we can comment on it.
Yeah, understood.
So Brandon, does that wrap up what you were hoping to clarify?
I think I'm good for now, Commissioner. Thank you.
I think what we found is that we don't know the answer that we would really like to know. Mike Buffo, is there anything that you were working to clarify that we did not get? Okay, and I've got a few hands up, and I'm going to turn back to Commissioner Banks because she was the first one who tapped me on the shoulder, and I don't want to jump to the folks online until I'm sure that she's had her opportunity.
So my question is kind of twofold. I think what I heard here moments ago was that changes can be made. You just haven't deemed any changes of any benefit to the counties as a reason or enough of a willingness to place any changes into the plan. A while back, you told me that if you pulled Spotted Owl out of the HCP, you would need a companion HCP. So that in itself told me that that would shove you through another process, that would be a big enough change to shove you through another process. So I guess I'm going to just circle to Chapter 9. I've talked about Chapter 9 a lot. And Chapter 9 is the current HCP that is able to be viewed by the public from 2022, and a number of people have testified to this, is that the department will be able to fund itself. And so that is a giant change that was alluded to in December that you guys will be going to in front of legislature in order to get funding through the general fund in the future, because the HCP will defund you. But then you go into a talking point that it's because the T&E costs are so great. While I was listening to your lovely, lovely presentation, I had time to scroll into the most recent SFAC meeting and come to the agenda item where it talks about survey costs into $2.1 million of survey costs in 2023. But your budget has grown. I had time also to scroll into last year's budget, and your budget has grown over the last decade over $10 million. And so the T&E costs, the growth of T&E costs over the last 5 years versus the growth of your spending over the last decade doesn't correlate. It actually shows that you might have a spending problem, not that the T&E costs and survey costs are what are causing you to have to get this HCP so that you have certainty over your future financially. And so I guess I'm going to circle back to how much is this HCP going to cost us? When we talk about, oh, we need financial certainty, it really is starting to be readily apparent that the cost, not only to the department, but to the counties, to the constituents, to the jobs, to the mills, to operators, to everyone, is going to be so much more greater than the cost of future T&E surveys. And so I guess I'm circling back for that middle ground. Like, I feel like that there is a middle ground here. I feel like, Chapter 9 is a giant change so I feel like there's room for potentially another change in order for us to find middle ground. Because you guys obviously didn't need that giant change in Chapter 9, obviously. And so if you have time for that giant change, maybe we have time for more changes. That's where I'm going.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. You want to respond?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's absolutely true. T&E survey costs are not the only driver on our budget. Absolutely. And that's a huge problem. We are not financially solvent right now. I want to say that right now. I've said it a number of times. The only way we managed to build our budget was through austerity measures for a number of years. We divested of forest inventory. We divested in a number of things. We have reinvested in those things. Additionally, costs that we don't control go up. Our fire assessment costs have gone up. Admin prorate, literally the charge for government services, has gone up. Everything has gone up in the meantime. And so we are currently, yes, deficit spending.
A quick follow-up to that.
I've got 2 more people who have questions and we're down on time. So I'm going to ask you, if you do it, it's got to be short.
Very short.
Okay, single sentence question.
Single sentence. Was 225 million board feet enough for you to have certainty in being able to pay your costs?
Because we don't know log prices, no. And that very much depends on that. At a certain log price, yeah, it is. And I want to say that when I say no to that, like recent log prices for us, and we brought this up earlier, lumber market's soft, but log supply is tight. And so log prices have been very good. So as a landowner, the revenues that come in from that have been pretty great. And I haven't actually done the math on that. But I would assume actually if we looked at our stumpage average right now, it would come pretty close.
Thanks. Quick comment on Chapter 9, just for clarification, and there's confusion internally as well. It's not, from the services perspective, you don't have to demonstrate that you can pay, that you're solvent. You have to demonstrate that you can pay for the commitments within the HCP. And that's a little weird because it's like, well, your harvest and this and that. But it's not, it's the actual commitments to do this monitoring, what, you know, X enhancement, X, Y, Z. Those are what you have to be able to demonstrate you can pay. So it's narrower than can you pay for your operations, just for clarity.
Thank you, Nick. Okay, I'm going to jump online. I think Commissioner Lovell had his hand up and Commissioner Sweet dropped his, but Commissioner Lovell, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. You know, my answer question a little bit because my concern was fuel load. Right now, all the acres that were taken off are going to obviously produce fuel every year. But you made a comment saying that they have to go in and maintain minimally those pieces of acreage for habitat. So my question is, from a business perspective, are we leaving a portion of the economic value on both sides here as a win-win situation to where people are going to have to go in and minimally maintain the habitat areas, and those can be for some economic gain for the counties that have to do that, and then the ODF and fire people and forest people don't have to worry about going in and doing that on a contract deficit basis. So is there something we can add there? I feel like all of us are leaving money on the table here.
Yeah, Commissioner Lovell, you broke up a little bit there, but I think I understand the question. And so when we talk about the habitat management activities inside of HCA's, some of them will be revenue negative to the department under our current, model and way of doing things. We will be looking for ways, and really outside of the HCP too, are looking for ways to pay for some of those. Make it clear that, it's a little bit interesting that, so the counties are never negative revenue on those, right? They may be very low revenue, but because we bear the operational costs, for the most part, it's the net revenue to the department, and we would be looking for ways to cover those, but we need to look for ways to cover those anyway.
Commissioner Lovell, did that answer your question? Oh, he disappeared. I think we lost him. We're going to assume that answered his question. We probably have time for one more question, and then we do want to talk, I think, just briefly about testimony and what that will look like at the Board of Forestry.
We had a question about grace permit value.
Yes, please.
It could be, Mike, it could be for you.
I'm sorry, I got kicked off.
Thank you, Commissioner. Was your question answered? Commissioner Lovell?
Not really. Well, but I think, I think economically we need to think of the strategy a little bit more. Burdening the ODF to do that. I think there's some deals that could be made here as a business perspective, but thanks for your answer anyway.
Thank you. Okay, Mike?
So the question, Mike, it could be for you or possibly State Forester or Mukomoto, or maybe a little of both here. Two things came up about grace permit value I hadn't heard before, and one is that the HCP is a benefit to all landowners by potentially preventing listings of other species. That's in the grace permit value handout. And then how State Forester Mukomoto mentioned earlier that it sounded like what I heard is that the constraint on log supply that the HCP could cause would increase log prices for private landowners. And so is that, should the board consider that a benefit when they're going through finding greatest permanent value?
As part of greatest permanent value. So yeah, the log prices one is a little bit sticky, right? Because it does cut both ways, right? I mean, if you're a landowner and that's the only thing you care about, then great, but if you're also considering the jobs on the other side and how that affects things, then okay, yeah, there's something to balance there. I mean, we do want to make sure, I think, just as that we are getting the full benefit that we get in any given market from the log prices there, that we're not, selling on the cheap necessarily. On the other side of it, I think with the greatest permanent value piece, I don't know that the benefit to other landowners doesn't really play into that. I mean, that's really outside the statutory context. It is in there. Yeah, it is in there on the sheet. There is a benefit there to other landowners. It is not really part of GPV. My apologies on that. Trying to size up these things on the various, on the different sheets. Didn't really lend itself to one. That's why there's two sort of things in the first place, is it didn't really lend itself to one or the other. Thank you.
Okay, we do need to end on time today. There's some folks who have other commitments they need to get to. So We're down to the last 10 minutes of our conversation. Is there one more burning question that needs to be asked as we consider the preparation for testimony?
Madam Chair, I just want to flag that Chair Sweet did have his hand up at one point. I don't know if his question had been answered, but it was registered there. So
Chair Sweet, was there a question that you had? I did notice your hand was up and then.
Well, I
went down.
did. I'll put it back up.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah. I've heard a lot about different component parts of why we do something, why we don't do something, but where are we right now with what we anticipate the total trust land production to be in terms of timber harvest?
So I would,
We must be, I'm sure that's something the board will want to know. You must have something close.
yeah, I would refer back to the outcomes that were presented at the December 14th meeting. And that was it. There's several different scenarios there. There's not a great deal of variance between them, among them rather. But if you look at the scenario that was non-declining even flow of volume planned at the district scale, it came out to 185 million feet.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure I had the same number in mind. Second question real quickly is, Mike, how resistant is that number to future reductions? Is that something we're can be pretty confident of over the years, or are there some big bumps out there that might adversely impact that or increase it?
So I think in terms of increase, that would be an implementation question. We have implementation options that was modeled for a non-declining even flow, which is what we've historically done. Doesn't have to be what we do in the future. That said, for things that would drive it further down, I think they would be things outside of ESA issues. And so that's another place for engagement with the board. So things outside of species that may have a negative impact on volume that people may be lobbying for, then other people would need to be lobbying to, testifying to the board, their opinion as to why those shouldn't be implemented, whatever those things are that would drive down volume further. I feel really good about the endangered species, threatened and endangered species side of the equation, federal ESA side of the equation, though, under this HCP.
Thank you.
To your question, Commissioner?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I think we know what we're going to know. And it sounds like the Board of Forestry opportunity, again, just to highlight that that is coming up on the 6th. The FTLAC testimony window is from 3:30 to 3:45. Remind me, Brandon, about that.
I believe it's in the 3 o'clock hour. Yes, a little later than it typically has been.
Okay, so it is in the 3 o'clock hour, and then I believe the public testimony that will take place regarding Cal's recommendation is the following day, and it is, I believe, is it the last item on that agenda?
I'm going to look at Samantha, but I believe that's correct. The public testimony is the following day. Sure.
Is the following day, and I believe it's around 11-ish on the agenda. No, I would love to have that. I think that we want to share that with all members so that we know where our opportunities are. So Chair Sweet and I have not yet had a chance to put our heads together and talk about exactly what the testimony will look like for FTLAC. Chair Sweet will be in person. I don't know that I will be able to be in person, so we will talk a little bit about that. Chair Sweet, do you have anything you want to say about FTLAC testimony specifically?
No, except while we're all together, any thoughts from anyone that we might consider?
Yeah, Commissioner Banks.
I mean, so looking at today's presentation and then, reflecting back over the last 3 years of these discussions, I think one thing that I would like FTLAC to focus on is the talking points that we have been led by the nose through for the last 3 years, starting with financial stability, consistency for the counties, best science, expense, so on and so forth, because I feel like each talking point that we have been fed and that the Board of Forestry has been fed has been readily negated by best science, the retrieval not being listed. For the 8th year in a row, no owls in Clatsop County. The new ODF study saying harvest at 60 years for carbon sequestration. So I think for me, it's pointing out the giant flaws in this HCP that if we took what we learned from it, we're not saying no HCP. And I'm so frustrated with this is our only choice versus no choice whatsoever. There has got to be middle ground. And I feel like, we have time to explore that middle ground. Or we should take the time, because I feel like the cost of this HCP is going to be so much greater than the savings, like exponentially greater than the savings of getting this HCP. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other commissioners have thoughts that you'd like to get into testimony. Commissioner Tucker, I see you reaching for the microphone.
So it is a frustration for me that after the years to get to this point and to be left with the fact the HCP feels like a train coming at me. And yet it's a train that I can't support. It is one where I am at a point where I don't know what the counties, the 5 that I've tried to represent, would want me to do completely. I think that 2 or 3 of us would want to be a no, an absolute. This is the wrong HCP at the wrong time, and that we need to stop and go back. And we've learned a lot in this 3 years, but at the same time, I don't know that there's the time, and I certainly don't think there's the vote. And that's the scary part for me, and a high degree of frustration.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. We have about 2 minutes left. Is there anyone else that has a comment, commissioners, that you would like to have Chair Sweet have? Yes.
One more thing, I'd make to ask if we could get a draft copy of the what you're going to present. Get a draft copy out to us as soon as you can. Feedback.
Chair Sweet, did you hear that one? Since it sounds like you may.
Oh,
who's
want
that?
a draft copy from us?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Thanks.
Perfect. And Chair Sweet and I will put our heads together on that. And if there is something else, or if your commissioner online listening with us and didn't have the opportunity to make your comment today, please do send that information. You can send it to Brandon, you can send it to myself or Chair Sweet, and we will work up what that needs to look like. And in the meantime, I also encourage everyone to keep their eye open. Yes, timing.
Yes, the Forest Trust Land Advisory Committee testimony is on March 6th, 3:30 to 3:45. On March 7th, there is the recommendation agenda item that is scheduled 9 a.m. to 11:30 a.m.
Okay, thank you. And you said the agenda item would be presented and then public testimony would be taken. And then the Board of Forestry will vote or not vote in their determination.
That is the typical cadence at the meetings. I will clarify that and make sure that's communicated out to the group.
Okay, so commissioners should plan to be present at 9 a.m. if you want to participate on that Thursday morning in that decision-making process and be present. Okay, with that, it is 11:50. Oh, Chair Sweet, your hand is
One real
up.
quick question.
Yes, please.
As I understand it, Cal was going to make available to us a draft or something, at least of his recommendations to the Board of Forestry sometime in the next week or so. That makes, is that going to make it a little awkward for us? I don't know that Cal would want us to be talking about what he's going to say before the day before the Board of Forestry gets it.
So I think I heard that we would have his recommendation by the end of this week, which would also be going, I assume, to the Board of Forestry at the end of this week. So we should get it when they get it. Is that correct?
Okay, is that right?
Okay, I would clarify that, Commissioner Scar. I was planning to hopefully have something out in board materials by the end of next week.
Okay, so the board and we will receive it at the same time.
Right.
Oh,
So,
okay,
yeah.
then that
So
does away
that
with
would,
it.
yeah,
Sorry.
that Friday would be the first.
Yeah.
So hoping to have that, it would be by the first with the meetings on the 6th and the 7th, leaving very short time. Okay. We will be prepared to be responsive to that one. I don't foresee our talking points changing significantly. I think we know the range of areas where we think this will land, but we'll keep our eyes open for that one. Commissioner Banks, last word.
Yeah, it's just a last word. I wanted to share that it was great that you guys went ahead and explained Tillamook to everyone. But as we all know, Tillamook is almost a status quo, but aren't for other reasons, being the type of harvest that you'll be allowed. It's kind of heartbreaking that you didn't do a Clatsop County, the county that is most impacted by this HCP, and it only calls into question in my mind why that choice was made. So that's it. That's no question. It's me pointing it out, and it's actually kind of heartbreaking and a little insulting.
So, all right, it is 12:02, so we will go ahead and adjourn this meeting of the Forest Trust Land Advisory Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Scar. Good job.
He's faster than you are.